Hello and welcome to the FSF podcast. This is the show made by nerds for nerds. So we would like to welcome you to our nerdery. Today, our guest is an author that we've wanted to have on the show for quite some time, and we've finally been able to make the stars align and get him here. Now, he has written for many high-profile series, including Star Wars, but there's also been Batman, Doctor Who, Assassin's Creed, Pacific Rim, Transformers, Back to the Future, Star Trek, Vikings, Adventure Time. There's a whole lot more. I was trying to get that all in one breath. It really wasn't working. But in 2018, he became one of the 5 authors selected to become one of the architects of the High Republic for Star Wars. I am beyond stoked. I am so very excited to have Cavan Scott with us here today. Welcome to the show, Cavan.
Thanks for having me. It's when you list them like that, I get tired just hearing all the things that I've worked on. It's just like I need to sit down.
Well, I was trying to, and I didn't even list everything. That's just a snippet. I mean, there's so much else out there that you've worked on. And, we always encourage people like, hey, just go to their website. You'll find everything they've ever done. But you've worked on some really cool stuff. And for me, this is awesome because although I am a massive Star Wars fan, I take my joy from other fandoms as well. Yeah. And you've definitely hit on a lot of the things that kind of tickle my nerd funny bone. So, it's kind of cool. So very, very excited to have you on here. We've had a couple of the other High Republic authors on, and we've had a lot of fun with them. Justina Ireland's been on the show, Claudia Gray, Daniel Jose Older's been on the show. We've had a lot of fun.
So you're collecting us all one by one.
You like Pokemon, yes. Yeah, Pokemon. You gotta have them all.
Yeah.
We'll get them all sooner or later. Got 4 of the 5. All right. So, but one of the things that we always like to start off with, everybody that we talk to, is we like to, because we're nerds, we like a good origin story. Who doesn't love a good origin story? So, in the origin of Cavan Scott, how did you get to where you are today? What were the things that really kind of directed your nerdery growing up and said, I want to be a writer, and this is why I chose to be who I am?
I suppose it was just from being a fan. I mean, I say quite regularly these days that my to-do list is the same as when I was 10, and at 51 I'm still going along that route, and it all came from fandom. It came from being a fan. It came from wanting to write my own, what now we know as fan fiction, for little fanzines that put together in people's bedrooms and stapled together and sent out, sort of the precursor to podcasts and YouTube videos and the like. And so, I just kept wanting to do this and writing for different things. And the two, the things I wanted to write for were things like Doctor Who and Star Wars. Now, Star Wars, I thought, I'm never going to have a chance to write that. I'm from Bristol in the UK. I mean, I didn't, at that point, I don't think I even knew it was recorded in the UK.
Sure.
And Doctor Who, well, by the time I got to the point when I could work in the industry, that had been cancelled and was apparently never coming back again. So I became a journalist. It's the only other way I could think of doing something in any way linked to the stuff I loved, by writing about it and what other people were doing. And through that, it's that classic thing: if you meet people and you hear things on the grapevine. And around 2000, which is scarily 25 years ago now, I heard that a company called Big Finish Productions were bringing back Doctor Who on audio format,
Nice.
and they were going to get the original cast back, the original Doctors, the original companions. This is, of course, long before the series returned on television. And I, with a friend of mine, we put in a submission to the slush pile, and by hook or by crook got it made, and that was the beginning of it, really. And so at first it was my side, what again we call side hustle now, then it was just called what you did. It was a hobby, and I carried on being a magazine journalist and editor and started doing more and more of these things. And to be fair, I think it was again Doctor Who came back in 2005. They suddenly needed people who knew that franchise and knew how it worked. And so I could gradually do more and more work on Who, less and less work on my day job. I mean, I obviously worked hard on my day job, but I could, suddenly that wasn't just my career. It was, I had this other thing that was coming on the side, to the point that I could jump ship and leave which was 2010, and go freelance, primarily for working on things like Doctor Who. And the route then led me through to Star Wars. It's because of my work on things like Doctor Who, Skylanders, the computer game, Angry Birds, working up a lot of the lore behind it, and various other franchise work. Gave me the chance to audition for a Star Wars piece, and it was literally that. I was given a brief, had to write a couple of chapters of a book, and we went from there, really.
Excellent. Okay, so kind of marrying up to that, this whole origin story question. So what was your initial exposure to both Doctor Who and Star Wars, since those are the two that you primarily talked about there? So, I always like to ask people what their initial exposure was, because now the reason I ask that, Cavan, is that I find that many times it also helps to explain their fandom, because when people come in at a certain era, you get to see which ones, especially in the Star Wars universe, for me, I get to understand where they're, maybe who their favorites are, and why that era then becomes important, because if you're an OG person, or if you're a prequel person, or if you're a sequel person, or you came in with the High Republic. I mean, obviously you were in before the High Republic, but you get where I'm going with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, with Doctor Who, I was a kid of the 70s, and you couldn't avoid Doctor Who. It was everywhere. Tom Baker was the Doctor. And it was, I'm British, as you might have gathered from my accent, and it's sort of in our constitution that you have to like it. That and James Bond. So, and again, I grew up at a time when Who was very popular, and then it went for a period when it wasn't so popular. And I stuck with it. It already sparked that element in me, and not just the show. I was a really nervous viewer of things, and I found the show quite frightening. But it was the books that tied in. So this is obviously pre-videos, pre-DVDs, downloads. So the only way we could get the old stories were through novelizations, which they put out every month. And so I became a reader because of them. There was a monthly comic. So I read the comic. And actually, it was the comics that led me to Star Wars, because Marvel UK put out Doctor Who monthly or weekly, as it was back then. And they also put out Star Wars weekly. And before I'd seen a film, I picked up the comic and I read Star Wars Weekly. I think it was the week after when they started to reprint the original 77 Marvel run, and it was the week after these adaptation, and they went straight into the story, which happened to feature in a certain green rabbit, which has become a part of my career at Star Wars, bizarrely enough. So yeah, I was just a little bit too young. And actually, I wasn't too young for Star Wars. I was too nervous. As I said, I was quite nervous at things that I had to watch. And I think my parents put me off watching Star Wars because they thought that a nervous child, how old have I been? 5, 6, it might have been too much for me in the cinema. They knew I find it quite hard sometimes, the cinema back then. Looking back, I find that amazing, seeing the cinema such a love now in my life, and also the kind of films I go and watch. But yeah, Star Wars was a good way into it, and all my friends were into it, and so I could sort of like get in with the group by reading the comic. And again, having the comic that came out every week meant that it just became part of your weekly. The weekly comic scene here over the UK was huge, from Humor Comics through to all the Marvel UK comics, and there were a lot of Marvel UK comics. 2000 AD, and so yeah, and then by the time Empire came around, I was a card holding fan because I'd been introduced by that comic run.
That's fantastic. Okay, so let me ask you this. Now, this is not only about your fandom, but also about your work. Thinking of Star Wars, what has Star Wars, and especially now that you're an author in the High Republic era, not just for the books, but you've also done comic books as well. What does it mean? What do those eras mean to you?
Well, again, the fact that when we created the High Republic, I had no idea what I was going to be working on in the High Republic. We originally we didn't divvy out projects. It was like, we created it all together, and then we were given assignments by Mike Seglain at Lucasfilm. So I had no idea I was going to be writing the Marvel comic. But to be writing that, knowing my backstory, you know, my origin story of how I got into it
Sure.
with the Marvel Star Wars comic, it meant a hell of a lot. I mean, I have been very fortunate that I have been able to write across all the eras in Star Wars. I've written original trilogy, I've written prequel trilogy, I've written, you know, the High Republic, and I've written sequel trilogy. They're all different for very different reasons. The original trilogy, because it's my trilogy, you know, it's how I
Mhm.
became a fan, you know. And again, similar to Doctor Who, you know, I was a fan in the late 80s, early 90s, where there was never a hope of any other, you know, there was never going to be another Star Wars film. And so we had books and we had comics, and the Dark Horse comics meant a hell of a lot to me, because that was my preferred choice of reading Star Wars. I mean, I read the novels obviously,
Mhm.
but the comics, again, comics have been such a huge part of my life, that's what I was immediately drawn to. So yeah, the original series, the original trilogy is, you know, is where I come from. Um, I'm also of the age of the prequel trilogy, and I have a complicated relationship with it, you know. And I look back now and seeing how angry I was around episode one, and just go, "You idiot!" But
I resemble that remark.
yeah, you know, it's and then, you know, things like Clone Wars came along, and then I was even angry about the Clone Wars, because it wasn't the same as my Clone Wars, which was the Republic and the Dark Horse. But you know what happened? I had children, and then I suddenly realized that there's a whole new Star Wars out there that
Yeah.
I perhaps haven't really embraced. And my kids were just the right age for Rebels. They found Rebels. I'd been trying to get them to watch the original trilogy for years, and the prequels, to be honest, and they didn't have any interest in it, but they discovered Rebels. um and they were, boy, were they the right age for Rey.
Nice.
Two girls who still look at Rey as being their ultimate hero. You know,
Oh, I love that.
she is their Luke Skywalker. And that
That's
doesn't mean
awesome.
they don't love Luke and Han and Leia. And my 18-year-old daughter still goes to bed underneath a Princess Leia light every night. So, you know, those characters are still important to them. But the sequel trilogy became something we experienced as a family, because it was the first time, you know, Rogue One as well, and Solo.
Mhm.
But those were the moments of going to the cinema together to watch Star Wars, which I don't think you ever forget. And so,
No. Yeah.
like all things, do I think every part of the sequel trilogy is perfect? No, because I don't think
No.
any part of any Star Wars film is 100% perfect, because there's always going to be something you disagree with. But I see that trilogy through the eyes of my daughters, and also the experience I had with them. And again, it was wrapped up in at the time when I was starting to work on Star Wars. It's my 10th anniversary of working on Star Wars this year. I started working in
Awesome.
2015. 2016 was when my first material came out. So again, it's all wrapped up in that sort of excitement about the you know, the sequels of Rebels. What my children were like, starting, you know, them starting to get the toys, you know, getting out my old toys and
Nice.
playing with them. And so, yeah, through that we went back and we revisited everything. We revisited the prequels, and a combination of seeing the prequels through their eyes, and also working on those characters. You know,
Mhm.
it gives you a you know, I had to write an 8-hour audio drama about Dooku, a character which, you know, I've been quite honest about, at the time I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about.
Sure.
And so you're forced to go back and really look at and appreciate the things that you've always appreciated, like Ian McKaig's designs, you know, just
Mhm.
the work on those beautiful movies. But then you really start to delve into the characters, and you see, you know, it gives you a new interpretation of what you're watching, and a new respect to what George Lucas did. And so, yeah, this last 10 years of working on Star Wars has been so wrapped up in family, because
I
not
love
only have
that.
I been working on all these projects, but they've been involved along the time. You know, the High Republic writers are a family, and so are our children now. You know, so like Charles and Rosemary. You know, Rosemary's now part of the group, as she's written with Charles on a couple of projects. My daughter Chloe is in Tempest Breaker. You know, because she's now at drama school, and so it's really hard to even separate them in my head, because it's so wrapped up in what our family life has been like, and our with friends and family and the wider group of Star Wars. And the kids have been a part of that all the way through, from, me sending messages from the Star Wars show set when all they wanted to do was talk to Andy and Anthony. In fact, there was a bit celebration in London. They walked past Lando and I was freaking out, and they were, freaking out to a certain level. Then they saw Anthony Carboni, and for them, I think that was the biggest moment of their life. My youngest was wearing a Star Wars show t-shirt because, again, for them, every week they watched the Star Wars show on YouTube, and it was their window into Star Wars and their way in. So
Very
yeah,
cool.
I've got so many emotions about Star Wars in the last 10 years because it's been a lot of hard work, it's been a lot of fun, but it's also been wrapped up in the family and my children growing up.
I love that. I think and I have a lot of similar experiences with Star Wars because you and I are similar in age. You said you're 51. I just turned 48. And my kids are, I don't, my youngest is 18. My oldest is 25. And it's been very interesting for me to watch my love for Star Wars kind of drift down into to my kids and see Star Wars through their perspective. And I think you said earlier, about how watching your kids, get into Rebels and all these different things, and watching my kids get into the movies. And, I think it's funny now because my oldest son has a dog named Kylo, and Kylo's a good boy. He's a really nice German Shepherd. And then, his son is named Lucas, which is, after George Lucas. And my middle son's, his middle name is Harrison, after Harrison Ford, because I may have a slight fanboy obsession with Harrison Ford, but we can talk about that another time. But I just see all these things, and I've one of the things I've really come to appreciate, doing this show and 200 and some odd interviews later, is the matter of perspective and how much perspective affects your view on things, good or bad. And I really love hearing stories like yours where there's the family perspective and things like that, and how that so alters how we look at things and how we change things. Because my daughter is just turned 18, and for her, she's not as big of a Star Wars fan. Lord knows I've tried, but she is a huge fan of Marvel comics, and she loves Ms. Marvel and Captain Marvel and all these things. And to watch her find, you mentioned them having their Han Solo and their Luke Skywalkers, to watch her grow in her fandom and have appreciation for those things. That's fantastic, because I want her to have those same. When I was a kid, I had my heroes, and I want her to have her heroes and people to look up to.
And do you know what the greatest thing is about that? My heroes are also their heroes. There is no, yes, they love Rey and they love Finn and and they love Poe. Good grief, do they love BB-8? My youngest is obsessed with Chewbacca, and I think wants him to be her dad. And I've pointed out that he does stay away from home an awful long time, and perhaps his son doesn't get to see him that often. And so there is she has a little shrine to Chewbacca in her room.
Love it.
But again, Luke, Leia, Han, Lando, C-3PO, R2, they're all just as important to them because they're part of the wider story. And it's been great to see, especially, as I said, I was a person who perhaps wasn't as welcoming to the prequel trilogy as I could have been.
Understood.
And it was a very different era as well. We didn't have the social media aspect to it as now, but there was enough of enough of discussion and discourse about the prequels.
Sure,
but
absolutely.
To see in their eyes that it's all the same. And I just think they're winning because they get all of Star Wars,
Right.
and to them it's one big story. And my daughter is both my daughters are at college. My oldest daughter's at drama school. They know how movies work, and they will again dig into a movie and they will point out the things that they don't necessarily agree with. But when it comes to like Star Wars, there's no, they just think it is one big saga. Every part is as important as the other, and they love seeing how it builds on top of of what's gone
Love
before. And it just gives me such a hope for the future of our fandom. That just like every generation, the generation of people who absolutely love the prequels, and then are now the people who are championing them and also making the things at Lucasfilm.
Right.
that are
Yeah,
pushing the prequels to the top of the pile. That's going to come as well for the sequels, you know, and it is
absolutely.
coming. It's not even going to come. You know, the celebration when Daisy came onto the stage in London and talked about the new movies, my phone was buzzing, not from people, not from, you know, social media or fans, but from my two girls who were going, "Is it true?" Because, you know, for them that was the moment they've been waiting for. Was
That's
some
awesome.
more eventuals of those people, because yeah, I mean, you know, my youngest daughter who was in a Chewbacca onesie watching the Rise of Skywalker, and there was a certain moment in that film I thought we were going to have to leave the cinema, because I was very glad that it was put right a couple of minutes later. Otherwise, I thought I'm not seeing the end of this film. Um, you know, they've just, as soon as those
Yeah,
credits run, they just want to know, when are we going to see these characters again? And the fact that now we're getting to, you know, 10 years after The Force Awakens, we're starting to see material coming through again with Poe and these characters, and there is more to come. They're loving it because they get it all.
that's that's great. I love that. All right, let's switch gears up just a little bit. And we've talked about your
Mm.
love for Star Wars. We've talked about your family, all these different things. But let's talk about your work for a second,
Mhm.
individually. Now, one of the things I like to talk to other authors and writers about is their process and
Yeah.
how they go about writing. And I've had different responses to this. So I'm curious to see what your take is.
Mhm.
When you're sitting down and you're crafting your story, no matter whether it's in Star Wars or Doctor Who or Batman, whatever it may be, are you more concerned with the characters first or world building first, or do you see it all as the same piece of the pie?
Characters always 100% characters first, before anything else, before world building, before theme, before message, beyond, you know, it's all about the characters and how they can work in whatever story it is. I mean, usually I do work in worlds where both my own and also other people's, where you have to start in a scenario, you have to start in a place, but I just find that paralyzing unless I've got a character. So immediately after this interview, I've got a meeting about a independent horror film that I'm working on, and the director came to me with an idea. Until we started talking about characters, I didn't have a clue what to do with it, because
Sure,
I need the characters. I need to know, and they don't have to be perfectly formed, but I need to know, you know,
sure.
the traditional things of wants and needs, and what kind of person they are, and how that's gonna, are they the right person, or actually, let's face it, are they the worst possible person to be in that situation? And until I've got a handle on those characters, I can't really get a grasp on the story at all. I mean, again, it was the same for the High Republic. Before I came up with the idea of Kyiv, I'd come up with a general idea. I mean, the character of Kyiv in the High Republic is very different to the original pitch I made for Kyiv in a lot of ways, but um, the basic core of the character was there. And as soon as I got her, then everything else started to fall into place. So it's always characters first. I get so fed up when people say, you know, oh, it's all agenda over stories, and you know, and it's all, you know, messages over stories. I was like, no, it's character, because character is story. You don't have story without characters. Story is the transformation of a character, and so yeah, for me, it has to be character.
Fantastic. Okay. So let's take that to a little bit of another direction now. You've also written for the Jedi Temple Challenge.
Mhm.
Now, how does that, and that's also where we get to meet Ahmed Best again as Kelleran Beck, which is fantastic, and love seeing him in Mando with that.
Yes.
That was so very heartwarming to me for him to get that level of respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but what what kind of writing is involved for a game show like that? You know, when you're forming the Jedi Temple Challenge, what are you looking to put into that show?
So I was lucky. So my part of Jedi Temple was the observation round. So you know, there was obviously there were the producers were doing in the other rounds. There was some more physical stuff the kids were doing, but I was responsible for the stories that the observation round were gonna be highlighting. So with that, it was a case of working out the different type of stories that we need over the episodes. But there was the fun element of it. It was a challenge because you had to have things that then you would be able to have a physical representation for, or a question related to. So it really made you think of all the different things you can do within Star Wars. So in some ways it was quite simple in the fact that I was responsible of writing so many stories and coming up with so many ideas. But at the same time, it was
Okay.
slightly different, twist to what I usually do, because we were going, well, how can this be? How can this become a physical thing the kids hold in their hand? How can we make that a question they've got to think out? And so yeah, it was a lot of fun working with that. And again, very similar to what stuff I do in elsewhere in Star Wars and beyond. It was dealing with working with artists, working with because again they were it was a told story. It was a droid telling a story, and then there was an artist representing it. So working with the artists, working with about Easter eggs and all the kind of things that we do. So that I love doing in Star Wars. Yeah, so it in a lot of ways it was just business as usual. But in other ways, it was this extra element that was really challenging in the best possible way.
That's cool. Yeah, because in my mind, it's there's because this is a written text. This is something that you sit down and read, and this is something I sit down and watch. In my mind, it was always just something so completely different and removed from the other that it's kind of neat to see that there's overlaps and how those two things come together.
Absolutely,
I've had other conversations with other authors who have worked on video games, and they're like, it's basically like writing a moving comic book. You're writing the story, you're doing these things, you have these characters, and instead of having a stationary picture, you're working with something that's moving along the screen. He's like, no different than animation.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I think
okay. So
my perspective, I come from because I originally came from, as I say, journalism and audio drama. So audio drama and script writing was always, where I started. So that lent naturally into working on video games, naturally into working on comics, naturally to working on TV. The one that was different was prose, because I suddenly remembered I had to describe things because there wasn't going to be someone else doing that job for me. Because when you're writing for all those other media, you're not actually writing for the end viewer, listener, reader. You're writing for the people you're working with. You're writing for your collaborators. You're saying, this is my idea, this is where we're going, what do you think? And yeah, dialogue is the same across. Again, it has its own particular challenges depending on the media you're talking about. But yeah, prose was the one that I had to work hardest at, because it was just me talking to a reader, which I haven't had to necessarily do in any of those other media, because the reader isn't, I say they're not my first audience, they're my ultimate audience, but my first audience and my first collaborators are the people I'm working with.
Okay, cool. Now, thinking back to the High Republic, and we talked about different eras in Star Wars and how you kind of got came along. Now, are there any other eras in Star Wars that when you look at it and you go, boy, I'd really love to see this era or this section of the galaxy explored? Because like I think of like the Ahsoka series, where now other galaxy somewhere else, and there's all different. I love the exploration of new places, people, and spaces. I think that's one of the fun things Star Wars is that we can go all these different areas. So is there a different area, or even if we're looking back to the High Republic, a character or era inside the Old Republic, High Republic era that you would love to see expanded on more?
I mean, I would love to Sith Empire. That's an era that I would love to write stories in, because I think it'll be so interesting. I'm always fascinated in stories about villains who have succeeded. I mean, in the world we live in, that's good that I'm interested in that. So I think there'll be lots of interesting stories you could tell within the era when the Sith are actually dominant, and in a different way to the Empire. Because it is far more dark fantasy led. You've got magic in effect. You've got wizards and sorcerers in effect.
Yes,
and you've got desperation from the population, the galactic population as a whole. Again, on the flip side, I'm dying to know what happens after episode 9, because I seeing I've worked on something which is in effect a prequel to a prequel for the last 5 years. I'm always happiest when things are going forward, and whether that's Star Trek, whether it's Doctor Who, whether it's Marvel, whether it's DC, I'm always wanting to know what's happening next. So I'd love to sort of work in that era of post the new New Republic? You know, what does
Hmm.
the galaxy look like after the New Republic's fallen and the First Order's fallen? You know, what does that world look like, or those worlds?
Oh
Um,
yeah, for sure.
as far as characters, I mean, it's so difficult because I've been so involved with certain characters and certain character stories in the High Republic, and it's still so. As we talk, I've finished working on the writing of the High Republic. I am now in the process of the comics and sort of bringing everything together. You know, we're seeing the art coming in from Marika. We had art on
Hmm.
issue 4 of Fear of the Jedi come in today. So I'm sort of seeing it all come together, and we're sort of like coordinating the end of this first big project we've had in the High Republic. Um, so it's really difficult. I'm still too entrenched in it to take a step back and say I'd like to
Fair
do
enough.
that as well. I think that we could have done so much more in phase 2. We didn't have the time or really at that point the need to write any more of the what we did. But there's so many stories that can be told about the frontier at that time and what it was like to be Jedi, non-Jedi, you know, Force users, non-Force users,
Right.
scoundrels. You know, there's just so much out there. Um, but yeah, I think probably I'd need to see the High Republic through to the end, and let's face it, that end is very soon now. Before I sort of step back and go, well, what other stories do I want to see in
Fair.
that era? Because I'm so intent now on just getting my part in that particular part of the saga over and done with.
Absolutely fair. Yeah, for me, you mentioned the Sith, and I would love to see a Sith centric story,
Hmm.
because there's so much that could be, and this isn't like, oh, we have to have Darth Revan, and whatever.
Hmm.
If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I would love to see a Sith centric story and see how we got to the point of having the rule of two, and how we get to all these other things, and um, when there was first came the mention of the series The Acolyte, I was like, oh my god, am I getting a Sith story? I'm getting a Sith story. Oh my god, I was so hyped for that. That not necessarily all that it was, but I still very much enjoyed that show. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to me to see where these different stories can go, because I'm also the guy in Star Wars that goes, okay, what non-Skywalker related story can we tell? Because there's so much out there that could be explored, that's not necessarily tied to a Skywalker.
Yeah,
Uh, you know,
absolutely. And also, I think if you look at the stuff I've written, especially in the High Republic, there's not it's not a accident that majority of the characters I've written are characters who perhaps walk outside the lines that they're supposed to be working within. You know, Keeve is a Jedi who questions the Jedi constantly, and
mhm,
not so much questions the Jedi, but questions whether she's worthy enough to be a Jedi. Skier has had a very interesting and difficult relationship with the Jedi over the last few years of his service. You've got people like Lorna D, former Nile, former bounty hunter, former princess, former everything, trying to find her place in the universe. I like those characters. I like the characters who don't just follow the road that's been laid out in front of them. And I think there is so much opportunity in Star Wars to follow those characters. Um, you say it's no accident that the Jedi I've written and probably concentrated on more are the Jedi who struggle with the path that they've it's literally been laid out for them since they were children. I think that's probably got a lot to do with how I view organized religions and that kind of society.
sure,
Um, and so yeah, those characters who operate just on the edge of perhaps what they should and question, those are the characters I like to get stuck into, and again
love it.
on the
Yeah,
villain side as well, not I, I characters who just follow without question I find very boring. Characters who question
same,
continually and perhaps push against I find very interesting. So yeah, I suppose it would be
same.
any part of the galaxy that has that opportunity for someone to question. Those will be the stories I'd like to tell or see as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so our conversation today has been very Star Wars centered,
Mhm.
and part of that is because when Lucasfilm says you can ask these certain number of questions, you go and you ask those certain number of questions.
Yeah.
But as we noted in your introduction, and we've talked about all throughout this conversation, it's not the only thing that you work on and spend your time in. So what can people look forward to in 2025 from Cavan Scott?
Well, I've got a new series that I'm working on with Nick Brokenshire, which is coming out from Distillery Books. Now, people will know Nick from his work on the High Republic and work for Dark Horse in comics and IDW for Star Wars as well. He's a fellow Brit. We've done a lot of work in Star Wars and outside. We've got a new series which is I can't really talk about much, but it's quite folk horror-y and sort of like American Gothic. Which I'm having a lot of fun. We're working on that at the minute. There is obviously Star Wars, Fear of the Jedi coming out next month, and the lead up to that this month in January in various different books. And other than that, I literally cannot tell you. There is, there is a comic I've got coming from Marvel, but I can't tell you what that is. And that's part of the problem with this job sometimes is that you can't always say. And there's some more Star Wars projects.
That's okay, though.
I can't talk about it. There are projects. I think 2025 will see me on the work side, doing more of my own work, more of my own original work, and in different media as well. I'm not saying there's going to be no more Star Wars from me, but there might be slightly less and slightly more of some other stuff as well. But there's still definitely some Star Wars to come. But yeah, I think it's going to be a year of new horizons, and also, as I said, the end of a project that has been my last 5 years. It's been the day job, and so that in itself is both scary and exciting. It's I still, in some ways, it feels like we've been doing it forever. In other ways, it feels like we've just started. And to know that we're wrapping up in a few months is crazy, and challenging in all the best ways.
I love it. The great thing about you not being able to talk about some of your work that you have upcoming is knowing that there's some cool stuff coming. And I always love that when people are like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't talk about this right now." That's okay. That leaves us wanting, that leaves us excited for something, and we get to see that come about. All right, Cavan, we have reached the point of our interview where we like to ask a silly question. And now the reason why this came to be, my co-host, her name is Kathleen, and she wasn't able to make it today, but Kathleen has a 6-year-old daughter, and they were out and about, and somebody asked her daughter this question, but not her. And Kathleen was like, "Well, when did we reach an age where people stop asking us this?" So the question is, Cavan Scott, what's your favorite dinosaur?
Oh, that's really hard because everyone loves a T-Rex. Can I say Grimlock? Probably Grimlock.
Sure.
T-Rex, I think, was always going to be out there. Triceratops, though. Triceratops have big pointy sword-like things on their head. It's amazing. What's the one with the armored back and a massive club as a tail? I think that was my favorite one.
That's not the Stegosaurus.
I can't think what the name is because I wasn't expecting to think about dinosaurs.
No, because I think the Stegosaurus is the one with all the spikes on the back. I can't remember.
Right. Okay.
I know what you're talking about. It's got like the scaly back. It kind of looks like an armadillo a little bit.
Yeah. But as a massive club as its tail. I loved that one when I was a kid. Pterodactyls are obviously not dinosaurs, but again, Swoop from the Dinobots. Basically, the Dinobots. The Dinobots are my favorite dinosaurs because they're Dinobots. Therefore, they're cooler. And Grimlock is king.
I'm not going to argue with any of that. I think the most unique answer that we've ever got. Somebody said Barney, and I was like, okay. I'm very much of a to each their own when it comes to fandoms and appreciations and things along those lines. So if that's where you sit on that, then good on you. By the way, I looked it up because that's what I do. It's the Ankylosaurus.
There we go.
Is the one with the club tail.
But still the Dinobots.
Armored dinosaur.
Always the Dinobot. I mean, let's face it. I went from loving that toy that I got from the London Natural History Museum for a kid to literal armored dinosaurs in the Dinobots. So I mean, I've still got my original Grimlock is over there looking down at me from my shelf that I've had
Love
for
it.
pretty much all my
That's
life.
fantastic.
So yeah, Dinobots all the time.
Love it. Okay. All right. Well, Cavan, thank you so much for being on the FSF Podcast today. Where can our
Thanks for
listeners
having
and
me.
followers go to find out more about you and what you got coming?
I think probably my newsletter is the best place to go, because who knows what's happening with social media. I mean, we can give out, by the time we give out social media addresses, and by the time that it goes broadcast, we're not using those channels anymore. So, but my newsletter is eternal, much like the Dinobots. It's the Cav letter, www.cavletter.com. And that's the best place to keep up to with all my Witcherings, the stuff I've got coming out, little behind the scenes information about some of the projects that I can't talk about right now, stuff I'm reading, stuff I'm doing, stuff I think other people should be looking at. So yeah, my newsletter, it's definitely the place to find me.
All right, perfect. We'll make sure to put that down in the show notes down below so everybody can check that out and give you a follow there. And as a reminder, guys, subscribe. You can do to help our show continue to grow. Get amazing guests like Cavan Scott here today and have moments for you to be able to listen to, laugh about, and share with your friends. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's honestly the best thing you can do to help out. And be sure to check out Cavan Scott again on all his channels. But primarily, like he said, we don't know what's going on with social media these days. What's here today may not be here tomorrow. So go check him out on his newsletter. Like I said, that is in the show notes down below. So guys, thanks for being here. Thank you for listening. And until next time, may the force be with you as you continue to live long and prosper. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Copyright 2025 FSF Podcast. Reference any specific product or entity mentioned on this podcast does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by FSF Podcast. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact us via email at info@fsfpodcast.com.